everyone, I'm Anjali Shukla. Welcome to my channel PC Cloud Security. And today we'll discuss authentication and authorization in AWS EKS. Let's get started. So this is chapter 5.1.3 of our OWASP EKS GOT AWS EKS Security Masterclass. So before diving into authentication and authorization into AWS EKS, let's understand what is basic authentication and authorization. So authentication is it verifies that which user is this or who you are. And in AWS EKS, it is either managed by AWS IAM or you have an option for OIDC as well. For this lab, we'll be focusing on AWS IAM authentication in AWS EKS. Next is authorization. It determines what are the permission user is having to perform on EKS cluster or in any application. It is managed by Kubernetes RBAC in AWS EKS. RBAC stands for Role-Based Access Control. Let's understand in detail about authentication in AWS EKS. We have two options, either IAM principles that is managed by AWS IAM users and roles, or we have OIDC. Next, we are authenticating a user in a cluster. So what will be the process? First of all, we'll create a cluster. Then via AWS CLI, we'll generate a kubeconfig file that is having details related to API server connections. Second, a specific token will be generated using AWS EKS GET token, which will allow us to authenticate with EKS API server. And lastly, we'll use the above generated token in an HTTP based request, for example, curl, and we'll authenticate our user and interact with the Kubernetes API servers. If you want to just have a look how the kubeconfig looks like, then that's how it is. You can find this file in kube/config file inside your home directory, and it has all the details related to the certificate authority, your API server endpoints, users information, and name of the cluster, etc. Second is authorization. So earlier we used to use AWS auth config, and it is deprecated now. We have another method which is access policies and access entries. It has certain limitations, and that's why it was deprecated. It was hard to determine who all has admin privileges in EKS cluster with AWS auth ConfigMap. And then even break the class roles also lacks some permissions when accessing the cluster. Even with the cloud security tool, you are not able to track the Kubernetes API access efficiently. So these were the reason mainly AWS auth ConfigMap was deprecated. Let's understand how the authentication and authorization takes place in AWS EKS. Whenever there is a request to access any resource received by API server, it uses a special component present in a control plane, which is AWS IAM Authenticator. So API server forwards all the requests to this component form of the authentication token, which then checks and verifies the user's identity using the credentials configured in terminal. So authentication token is nothing but a recent request for STS get caller identity. If you're not aware with this permission, then it is like who am I in Linux? We check with which user we have logged in. Similarly, in AWS, we run AWS STS get caller identity command to check with which user or with which IAM role we have logged in. So this is the same pre-signed request for STS get caller identity, and it leverage this request and then decode that token, and that reveals the AWS user identity. So that's how AWS IAM Authenticator verifies that user's identity and then sends this information to the API server. In November 2023, AWS introduced a better way to replace AWS auth config, and which was access policies and access entries. It is recommended to migrate from AWS auth to new access management, which is AWS access policies and access entries. If you want to understand in detail, in step by step, that how this authentication works in EKS, then you have to create a IAM user or role, or you can use an existing one as well. And then you have to give EKS describe cluster permission to that user And then we can configure our AWS credential and update the config file, and we can provide a cluster name here. So that's how authentication works place in AWS EKS. Coming to the authorization, ConfigMap was deprecated, though I will explain it to you how this method works. So first of all, we will get the config map with the name AWS-auth present in a namespace kube-system. I'll fetch the output in a YAML and will save in auth.yaml. Then let's say we have to give permission to EKS user. So we have to update under the map user section and ARN and the username. Both the things we have to update under the map user section. This is the first part. Second, we create a RBAC, Kubernetes RBAC, the role-based access control. We'll create a role here and we will provide all the permissions that I would like to give: create, delete, get, list, patch, update permissions on all the pods present in a default namespace. So I'll create this role and attach it to my EKS user. So this is a role binding I'm creating to attach this role to EKS underscore user. And now this process is completed. So that's how it works in case of an AWS auth config map. So first of all, authentication happens before authorization, and then we have to create a RBAC roles and binding in Kubernetes so that we can define a specific scope in a given namespace. Next, we have EKS Cluster Access Management. So it is very important that we are defining all the permissions to a user or a role securely, and we are following a principle of least privileges. And this method, the cluster access management, this method, it overcomes the limitations present in AWS auth config map. So let's understand what are the main parameters required in EKS cluster access management. So we have access entries and access policies. Access entries means users, the principles that we have to define though. So we defined AWS user or role here in the access entries. Second, we have access policies. So as the name suggests, the permissions that we have to provide to those users or IAM role, we defined under the access policies. So when you create a AWS EKS cluster, you will generally providing these three options: ConfigMap, which was AWS auth ConfigMap, the deprecated method. Then another option we have APIs, which uses the access entries method. And then we have an option for both. You can either use APIs or you can use the config map. This is mostly I've seen this method so that it gives you more control. So people are going with API and config map because they have the legacy architecture as well, and then they are developing and deploying new applications as well. So let's see if you would like to configure this cluster access with access entries, how you will do that. So for that, first of all, we'll create a key. This is a general method, like I'm using a user cluster-admin here, and I will create it access keys because that I will configure in my terminal, and I'll be generating or I'll be running commands for the access keys for access policies and access entry. Next, I will create an access entry. So to create an access entry, you have to provide a cluster name, use a command AWS EKS create access entry, followed by a cluster name. And lastly, we will add URN of the user to whom I am giving cluster access. That is cluster-admin in my case. Next, I will attach access policy, or I will create an access policy here. So for that, I will use a command AWS EKS associate access policies and will provide my cluster name, ARN of my user, and the policy that I have to associate with the cluster admin. So here I am associating Amazon EKS cluster admin policy. So this is my access policy, and access entry was cluster admin, this user. So this was it in this video where we have seen how authentication and authorization works in AWS EKS and how AWS auth config map is different from access entries. And also we have checked how AWS IAM Authenticator works and how it validates the user's identity. Stay tuned for more videos. Thank you, and do subscribe our channel.